right. And this is Wednesday's edition of Discussions of Truth. You have joined Wynwood Radio. That is Miami, Florida. I'm your host, Ian Hamilton Trottier. Follow me on Twitter. Follow me on Instagram. Both handles IANTROTTIER. Happy midterm. Whether your candidate won or not, my message to you is that should be beside the point. Okay, fine. Yes, vote. Get out, vote. That's the very least you can do. But we have there's further skin layers to this onion. And you need to start digging, folks. Past episode, Paul Craig Roberts. If you're not familiar with who he is, he was a senior economic advisor under the Reagan administration. World-renowned economist. He was on the program a few months ago. He says, Ian, Americans no longer have any rights. You don't have any rights. Constitutional rights you don't have. It's a facade. Okay, that's not verbatim, but that's the basic message that he said. Ray McGovern, he's been in D.C. for over 3 decades. Right-hand man in the CIA, that's my terminology, with George Bush Sr. Somewhere along the line of his almost 30-year career in the CIA, he said, wait a second. You know, there's too much intrusion. It's beyond fringe. This is wrong. I said, Ray, I said, what can you tell us about the military-industrial complex? What can you tell us about that? Because as Eisenhower was exiting office, he warned Americans of that. And if this is a new phrase to you, welcome to the program. The military-industrial complex, he rephrased that. He said, no, Ian, it's not that. It's no longer that. It is now the military-industrial media complex. Are you familiar with yellow journalism? Ever familiar with that? William Randolph Hearst? Do you know who that person is? Yellow journalism. Do you believe everything you see when you turn on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News? Do you notice how Fox News and MSNBC try to get you to one side or the other? You call that journalism? Do you call that free media? I don't. When I want news, I want to make my own opinion. Impeach mass media. Impeachmassmedia.com, as a matter of fact. And if you're in Periscope, you can find me right now wearing that t-shirt. Donate $50 to the program. I'll send you one. It's a nice quality, comfortable cotton. I don't wear anything else. I want people to support me to be comfortable. Okay, so what we have today is an incredible show, as they always are. Author and Temple University professor Joan Mellen. She's written over 22 books. She spent 50 years in academia at Temple University, to my knowledge. Her newest book, Blood in the Water, argues that U.S. President Lyndon Baines Johnson ordered a hit on his own naval ship, even the USS Liberty, a U.S. spy ship, an auxiliary intelligence research ship. In its day, it was the world's highest equipped ship for intelligence. It was the most up to scale intelligent ship on the planet in anybody's Navy. It was in international waters during the 6-day war that Israel, amongst a couple other countries, but primarily Egypt, was involved in. The boat was attacked by Israeli forces. An 8-hour surveillance. Israel is a friend, not foe. So why was this ship attacked in 67 by Israel. Okay, an accident. That's what Israel is saying. Mellen's work, which includes A Farewell to Justice, Our Man in Haiti, and Great Game in Cuba, explored a history of the Central Intelligence Agency. She says, and she'll be joining us in a matter of moments, that Blood in the Water describes how the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Israel conspired to form a collusion to ambush the USS Liberty. We will hear from her in moments. Next week, we will be joined by vaccine fighter Dr. Judy Mikovits, one scientist's intrepid search for the truth about human retroviruses and chronic fatigue syndrome, autism, and other diseases. She'll be joining the program. She has a stalwart career regarding many aspects of medicine, including the National Cancer Institute in Frederick, Maryland. And on the 21st of this month, Christopher Fulton will join us. He spent time behind bars because of the information he had in regards to the Kennedy assassination. This is the era. This is the Trump era. Welcome to it. Like him or not, this is what we're dealing with. Fake news. And as a matter of fact, for me, this journey started 2 years ago. Coming up on 2 years in the broadcast booth here in Wynwood Radio. Because of a virus called Zika. Christopher Fulton's forced descent into the darkest parts of government power has now boomeranged on that power. Fulton has not come back from hell, USA, with a silenced voice. He has miraculously survived to share with us all the truths we must know if we are to keep our America the land of the free. This coming from Don Clark, journalist, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times. They're not light words. These are heavy times, Americans. And I urge you not to take sides politically because your political party system is a complete mess. The book is submitted for the Pulitzer Prize. The Inheritance, Poisoned Fruit of JFK's Assassination. He will be on the program the 21st. The book will be available for purchase on the 22nd. We'll close out this month with David H. Janda, MD. He hosts Operation Freedom on WAAM Talk 1600. He's an orthopedic surgeon based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He's got some things to say. Again, we're going to go down the vaccine world about and some other items as well. Just added to the program. Actually, I'm going to cut to a quick break, and I'll be right back. I'll introduce who's been added to the program, and go from there. Thanks for tuning in. This is Discussions of Truth on Wynwood Radio. And I'm back. I want to quickly, before we bring on our next guest, I want to quickly mention the following. We've got a slate of incredible guests, as always, lined up for this program. Jefferson. I think he goes by Jeff. I'll introduce him on the 12th of December. He's a Washington, D.C.-based author and veteran journalist of over 30 years. His novelistic nonfiction books explore untold chapters in the history of the American nation. He applied his investigative reporting talents to a 15-year career at the Washington Post. Morley combines granular detail, quotes, with storytelling venue, end quote, to capture unknown realities of subjects as disparate as the Central Intelligence Agency and America's legacy of racial violence. His writings have appeared in such publications as Salon, The Atlantic, and The Intercept and the Washington Post. Morley is one of the world's most credible authorities. We're going to dive down again on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. He's an editor of the blog JFK Facts. He sued the CIA for certain records related to the Kennedy assassination in 2003. 14 years later, his lawsuit, Morley versus CIA, is still active in federal court. Why? He is author of 3 distinguished books, of which Our Man in Mexico, his biography of the CIA's Mexico City Station Chief, Winston Scott. Jefferson's current work is a blog called No Other Than the Deep State. Some other great guests lined up for you. Thanks for tuning in to Wynwood Radio. As mentioned, we will be returning with author of Blood in the Water, Temple University professor Joan Mellen. I'll be right back after this. A little Metallica. I think too much. Ow! Welcome back. This is Discussion to Truth. Every Wednesday, 5 o'clock, I'm right here, Wynwood Radio. I'm your host, Ian Hamilton Trottier. Follow me on Instagram or Twitter. Handle is IANTROTTIER. And certainly, patron the recent campaign that is launched, Impeach Mass Media. We have with us today a very special guest from Temple University in Philadelphia, author of Blood in the Water, Joan Mellen. Joan, are you with us?
I am. Hi, Ian.
Hi, nice to meet you, and thank you for graciously coming on to our program. I think most Americans have no clue about the book that you have written. Joan, would you take a moment and please tell us a little bit about who you are, what you've done in the past, and what got you inspired to write a book regarding this that you've written?
Well, for one thing, I don't teach at Temple anymore. I retired as of this past July. But for many years, I taught in the creative writing program at Temple in the English department. I've written 24 books. This book, Blood in the Water, is my 24th, and it has a subtitle, How the U.S. and Israel Conspired to Ambush the USS Liberty, which tells us a bit about what the thesis of the book is. And the book is about an incident that is almost no one knows about it, really. Very few people know about it. And how I came about it, I was writing a book about Lyndon Johnson, and it was published in 2016. It was called Faustian Bargains. And in the section on Lyndon Johnson's presidency, I discussed the USS Liberty. And how did I find? I didn't know anything about the USS Liberty, but one night a Texas researcher, called me up and said, "Are you going to cover the USS Liberty?" And I never heard of it. I said, "What's that?" And so he told me about how Lyndon Johnson called back the planes that were sent to rescue the sailors after they were attacked by rockets and machine guns and all the rest. The USS Liberty was an unarmed surveillance ship. It was a spy ship. Its role was to tap into cables and listen in on the Soviet Union and other countries in the Middle East. It was not spying on Israel, and Israel, in fact, had nothing to do with it. So then suddenly this attack occurs, and the Liberty, they can't defend themselves, so they're just mowed down there by these attacking planes. And then the Israelis also sent torpedo boats, and they fired torpedoes, one of which went through the starboard side of the ship, and people I don't know how many died right then and there. And then some drowned because water filled the torpedo made a 40-foot hole in the ship, and water came in, and then he drowned like that. So there was never at the end of the day, of that day, the same day, June 8th, 1967, Israel took responsibility and said, "We did it. It was an accident. It was a mistake. We really thought we were attacking a Egyptian horse freighter." And this is preposterous. It's preposterous today. It was preposterous when it was written in a book about the Liberty by a retired bankruptcy judge in Florida called Crystal, A.J. Crystal. And there's been a tremendous cover-up. The cover-up began the week after the attack. And the sailors on the ship were ordered not to tell anyone about what had happened or where they had been. They went to Malta. The ship did not sink, by the way. The object actually was to sink the ship. Everyone drowns. No one has any explanation. Then Egypt is blamed for the attack. The U.S. then bombs Cairo, and the planes were actually sent to bomb Cairo, and they were 7 minutes from target when they were called back. And the reason that they were called back is that the Liberty didn't sink. And in fact, the sailors sent out an SOS to the 6th Fleet, and the 6th Fleet was told to send planes to help them. They asked for help. I mean, they were drowning and dying, and they asked for help. And the sea captain, one of them on the USS Saratoga, was an honest man, and he sent planes. And they were called back by Robert McNamara. And then the captain could not understand, why are they calling back the planes when the people are being attacked? So then, 90 minutes later, they sent out another set of planes, this time from both the Saratoga and the USS America. And they too were called back. And the admiral who took the call said, "I'm not listening to you," meaning McNamara. And at which point, Lyndon Johnson grabbed the telephone and said, "Call back those planes. I will not embarrass an ally," which indicates that he had foreknowledge of the attack. He knew that an ally had attacked the Liberty, and what other ally was in the area? It was, of course, Israel. So and nobody has written about this collaboration between the U.S. and Israel. Most people who've written about it blame Israel because they actually did the attack. But that's false. It's false to blame Israel. It's false to blame the United States alone. The two of them together committed this act, and the cover-up has held for more than 50 years.
Now, this is the first edition that you've written of this book, and it's yet released?
It's going to be released in a few weeks. The publisher called me yesterday and said they actually have books finished books, which
Great.
is amazing. But the Amazon will not release the books until December 11th. But you can order it on pre-order and get a discount that way because it's coming. Because they've already sent me my books, since I'm a special character in the story, by UPS. So I just got the email, the tracking number of the books that were. I was so excited that when UPS came today with 2 packages, I thought
Wow.
it must be the book. Well, it couldn't be the book. They just mailed it today. But I'm looking forward to the book. I'm having a book launch in New Hampshire, and the reason is why New Hampshire. It's because it's the residence of the chief intelligence officer on the USS Liberty, who helped me enormously with this book and to whom it is dedicated. That his name is David Edwin Lewis.
Okay.
Command.
Great. Excellent. Well, congratulations. Who's the publisher, Joan?
The publisher is Prometheus Books, which is a very small intellectual publisher. And the publisher told me that why did they take this book? It was because they're very interested in cases of history that have not been examined, unresolved issues of history.
Excellent. Now, so Joan, what was the USS Liberty doing in those waters?
Well, nobody knew. And you see, they went up there. It was in the middle of the Six-Day War. I neglected to say that. And this is the Thursday. The Six-Day War began and ended on Monday. The Israelis bombed all the Egyptian airports and airfields and so forth and destroyed everything. And there was no more Egypt. And suddenly, but that was not the whole story. What is the motive, you might? The motive was to depose Nasser. Nasser had been a thorn in the side of CIA for years, and also a thorn in the side of Israel. And Israel had concocted a terror campaign a decade earlier in Cairo and Alexandria to set off devices, and these were operatives of Israeli intelligence. They were Egyptian Jews who hoped to migrate to Israel, and they were to set off various devices, bombs, in post offices and libraries and movie theaters, and create such a havoc that Nasser would be undermined by that. The U.S. would then switch its aid, the money it was giving that had been giving to Egypt, and give it all to Israel. That was the motive for that. But they hadn't gotten Nasser. Somehow Nasser was still there. And so this is another attempt to get rid of Nasser. Nasser was socialistic. He was really neutral. He was head of the third world countries that were not aligned with the U.S. and not aligned with the Soviet Union. He was an annoyance. Russians didn't like him either, and he had many communists in jail in Cairo for various crimes. So the communists were not crazy about Nasser really either.
And Israel,
he didn't care. He was truly independent. He died a few years later, and I think 3 million people came to his funeral. Big. Wow. He was a big figure on the world stage at the time.
Yeah. And what was Israel's biggest issue? The Six-Day War was primarily Israel and Egypt, but were there some outlying countries involved as well, like Syria? I don't know the history of the Six-Day War.
Only in the sense that Israel was always attacking Syria.
Right.
And Israel finally attacks Syria and grabs the Golan Heights. And the object was to take Damascus, to go all the way to Damascus. This they did not do. They stepped back. What they're doing, obviously, is gaining territory. All the territory that Israel gained in the Six-Day War, they still have. And the settlements, they made settlements, as we know, up there, and those settlements are still an issue today. Israel never gave back any of the land that it conquered in the Six-Day War.
And in Damascus, or excuse me, Dimona. Dimona is a location for the nuclear reactor. Did that come into play at all?
Dimona is the big location in Israel for their nuclear reactor, nuclear bombs. And the only president in those years that really was questioning that was President Kennedy. President Kennedy wanted inspections. He wanted a level playing field on nuclear weapons in the Middle East. And the Israelis told him, we will not be the first to have an atomic bomb in Israel. Of course, that was a complete lie, but we're used to lying now. But not so much then. It's horrifying to see Shimon Peres and all of it lying to President Kennedy and saying we will not have a bomb.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
Anyway, when Kennedy did send inspectors, so then what the Israelis did was create elevators and buildings and efforts to conceal the whole thing. And Dimona was concealed. It was, I think, what were they calling it? A textile mill or something like that. It was just, they never admitted. To this day, does Israel admit that they have the bomb? They've had the bomb since at least before President Kennedy's time. They took the uranium from a site in Pennsylvania.
Interesting.
And they brought it over there, and that was how they created Dimona. And one of the things that the head of the Mossad said to the CIA station chief in Tel Aviv was that which was false, that the Soviet Union was about to attack Dimona. I don't think so. There's no evidence of that. But that was the pretext. See, they needed a pretext. They couldn't just do this. Today, I guess we still need pretexts.
Yeah.
It's called the false flag operation, I guess.
Yeah, a false flag. Under what administration did they obtain the uranium there from the United States?
That's a good question, because I can't remember now. It must have been under President Eisenhower.
Uh-huh. And then Eisenhower...
Eisenhower was neutral, didn't say anything. But by the time President Kennedy became president, they already had those bombs at Dimona.
Are you familiar with the term military-industrial complex?
Yes. Yes. And also we have to add the word intelligence to that.
Oh, I'm proud of you. Thank you. Where do you put that word in sequence?
I don't know. Military, of course. Intelligence, because the CIA was running the show, and they were really running the country, frankly. President Eisenhower knew it, and he didn't like it. And one of the things that happened in 1956 during Eisenhower's presidency was that Eisenhower commissioned a study of the clandestine services of CIA. You know what they were doing. And so who does he hire? He hires James Doolittle. Doolittle was bombing Japan. He was one of the aviators in the World War II. And Doolittle didn't know a thing, so he asked Allen Dulles to help him. Well, you can imagine. So President Eisenhower read this, and he reassigned the study to a very famous ambassador who may be forgotten today, called David K.E. Bruce. And Mr. Bruce, ultimately he'd been ambassador to France, to Germany, to NATO. He was the first ambassador to China, and so forth. So he did it. He did it with Robert Lovett, who was I think he was the Secretary of Defense under President Truman. And Bruce was adamant that CIA was, he hated the dirty tricks. And after he wrote the report, he was appointed to, that was when he was appointed ambassador to Germany, and he sent a message to CIA. He says, I don't want to hear the sound of CIA spades digging, meaning in Bonn, while he was ambassador. But in 1945, when the idea of CIA was raised, Bruce was asked his opinion, and he wrote a very famous article in the Virginia Quarterly Review, in which he said he was afraid of a new Gestapo. Now, Gestapo, of course, was a word that was very well used during that right after World War II.
Yeah.
He saw the future of CIA in its being a Gestapo, and it's not far from the truth. Certainly, they were the engineers of the Vietnam War.
Yes, I've looked extensively to some degree into Anthony Sutton, and I mention him frequently on the program. He's a former Hoover Fellow at Stanford. Are you familiar with the research that he's done?
No.
So Anthony Sutton basically goes down this military-industrial complex, but he identifies main players within it. And he roots that through an institution at Yale, and such names as Pillsbury, Rockefeller, Bush are all tied in to this institution at Yale. And
I forget the name of it. What's the name of that institution? Another member of it was James Angleton. Who was the head of counterintelligence for CIA for years and years.
And the Harrimans are tied into it as well.
What is the name of that club?
Well, I mean, it's commonly.
I can't think of it.
Sure, it's commonly referred to on two different. Most people know it and identify it as the Skull and Bones.
That's it. Yeah.
And then others, and perhaps members themselves, might refer to it as Lodge 322. But it
I don't know
roots.
about that. We all know it as Skull and Bones. That's
Yeah.
common knowledge of. It's even in the movie of The Good Shepherd, which is about James Angleton.
Yeah, you know, it has appearances in there's messages that kind of flash in a TV series and like Batman and whatnot. So and certainly Bush has a strong connection to the CIA, and of course
Bush was connected to CIA forever, and
Yeah.
eventually, a short brief time, he was Director of Central Intelligence, but that was only for about a year as a stopgap during the time of the Church Committee. But it's all connected, as Don DeLillo writes in his book, Underworld. Everything is connected.
Joan,
Or maybe it's in Libra. I don't remember.
I want to kind of segue and get back to Blood in the Water. I mean, this is
Yes.
something that obviously makes
about how this crime began, how this attack, where I spent half the book discussing the lead up. Where did the idea come from for an attack on a ship and the false flag operation? Of course, it originated in Remember the Maine, when the United States attacked its own ship, the Maine, and blamed Spain. But so it's very similar. It's also similar to Operation Northwoods, which is a list of dirty tricks that was sent to Robert McNamara to do to Fidel Castro, among which was an attack on a ship and an attack on a building. It sounds like 9/11. So all that there are precedents for this. And of course, there's the Gulf of Tonkin, where we fire on our own ships and blame North Vietnam. So this is a common dirty trick in the bag of dirty tricks. And where were we? I'm sorry, I forgot your question.
Well, no, I liked where you were going, and then I was going to throw in for listeners that Cubans, in conjunction with the Russians, were running surveillance operations along the west coast of Africa at the time that the U.S. Liberty.
Yes, that's right. In fact, Che was there. So one of the assignments for the spy ships of the NSA, and this was not the Liberty but others, was to find Che. That they were obsessed. CIA was obsessed. Find Che. They never did. It was eventually got them They got him in Bolivia, but he was in Congo.
Interesting.
And I discuss it in the book. My book is more. It's better told as the subtitle: How the U.S. and Israel conspired to. No, wait, I have it in front of me.
Ambush.
How the US
ambush.
and Israel conspired to ambush the USS Liberty. And the one thing that some of the sailors of the Liberty, when they saw the subtitle, the word that they liked best was ambush, because that's how they felt. They felt they were set up. And they were set up. You might ask, you started to ask, and I didn't answer, how come the Liberty was up there?
Yeah.
There was no surveillance. There was no information that they needed, that they were supposed to get. They were just up there. They were up there to be attacked. They were up there to be the false flag and to be the blaming Egypt. They were there to be sacrificed, scapegoats. And who was the one who sent them up there, you may ask? Well, that leads us to part of other skullduggery, which is something called the 303 Committee, which was operating out of the executive branch of the government. Many CIA figures are sitting there, but the Lyndon Johnson's aide and person who did his bidding and was Assistant Secretary of Defense, Cyrus Vance, was the one who sent Liberty. How did I know that? Nobody knew that. How did I find that out? I'm not so brilliant. What happened was there was a report after the fact. There was a report by the Joint Chiefs. They sent a fact-finding mission to investigate the situation. They were prepared to cover it up and create pretexts and everything, which they did. But suddenly there's a sentence in that report, this Joint Chiefs report, and it says Cyrus Vance and 303 sent the ship up to the East Mediterranean. They forgot to redact it. One of the reasons you should sit and study and read the documents is because they make a mistake. That was a big mistake that they made that no one cares, of course. But that's how I know that for a fact. They didn't make anything of it because they're not taking our point of view or my point of view, that this is a horrible, terrible, murderous war crime. And, this country prides itself on military, on not leaving anybody left on the battlefield. Nobody, no, right? No, and
Right.
here's Johnson leaving not only leaving them on the battlefield, but contributing to their deaths.
Right.
You know that when this whole thing was set up, and I discussed in the book how we sent planes to bomb Cairo off the USS America. Well, another thing that happened on the early morning dawn hours of June 8th, the Strategic Air Command was set in motion, and planes went out on the runways with bombs. You know, that, like as in Dr. Strangelove, if you ever saw that, where the planes get ready to send out nuclear bombs. These planes were sent, and they were kept running on the runway, all ready to go, and were waiting final orders to fly out. Now, and one of the pilots who was in one of these planes, and he was in the Air Force in Sacramento, talked to a writer named Peter Hunam, and there it is. He regretted doing it. Of course, people who tell the truth, it's very hard to tell the truth, especially military people. And he was already retired. But then they sometimes make people who are honest. They might just tell the truth because that's the first thing they think of doing. And the planes were also sent out on the runways in Germany and other places where the Strategic Air Command was posted, not just one place. The orders had to come from Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Is it Nebraska? Where is Offutt Air Force?
That sounds right.
Oh, Omaha. That's right.
Oh,
Omaha.
okay, yeah.
In Nebraska. So now I had written about that in another book. I'd written about Offutt Air Force Base and what was going on there. And my book's about the Kennedy assassination. See, I've written before. I wrote a book called A Farewell to Justice, which is about Jim Garrison's investigation of the Kennedy assassination. And Offutt Air Force Base figures in that because one of the people involved in the Kennedy assassination, a friend of Lee Harvey Oswald named Thomas Edward Beckham, was sent to Omaha. What was he doing at Offutt Air Force Base? It was all connected. Anyway, that's another story.
No, that's.
But I've done
really
a big book about cover-ups and dealing with the Kennedy assassination, and that's how I knew. With the sailors of the USS Liberty always are asking for a government investigation, because they were quite right in saying that the Navy inquiry that was done was totally corrupted, and they want a government investigation. I try to tell them, I don't say anything, that the Kennedy assassination had a government investigation, didn't it? It was called the Warren Commission.
Right.
And it was a total farce. So you don't look to the Fox to discuss what happened in the hen house, if I may say that, if you want to talk about the military intelligence industrial complex.
Well said.
I think that the intelligence is far stronger than the industry. Of course, the whole thing is motivated by protection of American business abroad and companies, corporations, worldwide corporations, global. You know, I heard I heard Trump say today, global. He used the word globalized.
In what context?
In the press conference, somebody had challenged him for saying that he was a nationalist, which he did say. And that means something to some people who know history, know what a nationalist is. And it's connected to fascism. Uh-huh. Right? Hitler was a nationalist. They were for Germany. Germany needs more Lebensraum and all other room to grow and, you know, all that. He doesn't know history, so he doesn't see how closely he parallels fascism. Never mind, that's another subject.
Right. No. And there's so many different tentacles that stretch from so many of these different subjects. For instance, Hitler, he's working on this superior race of Nordic type people with those features. But Hitler, this predates Hitler, arguably hundreds of years, and certainly in California, and efforts through institutions like Stanford and the U.S. Army, there are documents that are published that this was happening here in the United States, in California, a couple decades before Hitler. But if we even go back further, we can go to Plato. And Plato having. Writing about his republic and producing the best type of procreation in matches, but that is something completely different. we've got something here where U.S. servicemen died very innocently, and what is needing to be spread here, and this story for decades, 50 plus years, has been squashed by mass media. The key here is that the United States under LBJ knowingly attacked their own ship in conjunction with Israel.
Yes, but bear in mind, too, it's so shocking. It seems that all these people, don't forget, all these servicemen and the ones that are surviving, they're all in the military. So it's very hard for them to get their minds around the fact that their own government betrayed them.
Right.
But they did. And we have Remember the Maine. I'll repeat that again. It's not the first time. Gulf of Tonkin. It's not the first time that the U.S. fired on its own.
Right. And it's this whole false flag concept, like you've mentioned before.
Yes. And but for 50 years, every president and these survivors, the ones who survived, have been begging president after president, congressmen, senators, to please investigate, to please look into this, to please say something about it. And Dave Lewis, who is, as I said, the chief intelligence officer, and he was responsible for all these people down there that were where the torpedo hit. Anyway, he called up his own senator up there and asked if he would help. And the senator came to the phone because this is a very folksy type senator that you'd think he'd be a likely candidate to involve himself. And his name was Bernie Sanders. Uh-huh. And Bernie comes on the phone and he listens and he says, "This is not appropriate." So Dave says, "Well, I know a rabbi in the area that might be the intermediary that could do it." "No, that's not appropriate either." And then Dave called his other senator, which was Patrick Leahy, and he too gave pretty much the same answer. Nobody wanted to touch it. Why? The truth, and in fact, that's what we don't know about this. The history books don't know it. The media won't even mention the Kennedy assassination these days. And I'm talking about cable. I'm not talking about Fox News. Right. It's really, we're getting more. The more the truth is concealed, the more censorship there is. The more we're getting away from the principles that the country's supposed to stand for: freedom of the press, freedom of thought, debate, democracy.
Right. Well said, Joan. Very well said. Some great words here. Now, you've been working with Dave, and the U.S. military, of course, when the survivors returned back to the homeland, they were threatened with being court-martialed if they came forth and spoke out. Has that changed now? The survivors that are...
Yes. Good point. Excellent point. You see, in 1979, after this is all in 1967. So in 1979, one of the sailors, whose name was Jim Ennis, decided he's going to write a book no matter what. He didn't. The threat was still on. No one ever took it away. But he wrote a book, and it was published by Random House, and nothing happened to him. So that pretty much broke it. Mm-hmm. And Dave too, he didn't speak about this until he knew he was the source that Lyndon Johnson had called back the planes. And when he was torpedoed, his eyes, and he was in the hospital on the USS America. And one of the admirals of the fleet, named Admiral Geiss, Geiss, he said, "After you're ready, come to my stateroom," which is his office. "I want to talk to you." And Admiral Geiss then told him the story of how Lyndon Johnson had intervened and called the planes back and prevented them from going to the rescue. But he said, "You can't talk about this while I'm alive." Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Everybody's terrified. What are we? So anyway, Dave, good soldier, right? Good sailor, went to the Naval Academy. He kept quiet for 10 years. And then he was at a reunion of the sailors, and he saw a very courageous admiral named Thomas Moorer, Moorer.
Right.
And Moorer mentioned to Dave that Admiral Geiss had died. He had a hip operation. It didn't go well. He died. So now, only at that point, did Dave feel free to talk about the Lyndon Johnson aspect of the story. He wouldn't. The man is incapable of lying, and none of the biographers of Lyndon Johnson, they're covering up for him on a daily basis, have mentioned this.
And this Thomas More that you speak of went to Capitol Hill in 2003. You're familiar with that?
Well, he wanted the information for the circumstances for why those planes were called back. And when he had become chairman of the Joint Chiefs now, he got nothing. He still could find out nothing about the circumstances of the attack on the Liberty.
Mm-hmm.
He gave comfort. I mean, he was very close to the sailors and to the story, but he couldn't find out anything. He was at the highest level, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. That's not, this is not a country run by military. So, military-industrial complex, though it may be,
right? They
closed him out. He couldn't find out anything because who knew the story? The story very few people knew it.
Yeah.
Cyrus Vance knew it, right? And also, I'm thinking the CIA station chief in Tel Aviv, whose name is John Haddon, and I wrote a lot about him. He's one of the main characters in my book, knew about it. Israel knew about it. Lyndon Johnson, of course, knew about it. Who else knew about it?
So, Joan, at this point, I want to introduce, and I'd like to hear your opinion in regards to, certainly you're saying that military doesn't run the country, and you have previously in the show here for listeners mentioned corporations. So if we go back to banking, I want to insert so we can hear your opinion. What do you think about the Federal Reserve?
Yes, I know that you think that that's the heart of the matter. I don't happen to think so.
Okay.
President Kennedy didn't like the Federal Reserve, and
right.
He had threatened, in fact, prior to his death, of course, that he was going to get rid of them. And many people see them as a force. Well, what is it? They're really a force for the infusion of capitalism into international waters.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's and we don't. If you didn't have them, you'd have someone else. They're facilitators, but I don't see them as the motivating force of what's going on here.
The USS Liberty, in its day, it was the state-of-the-art intelligence ship.
Yes and no. I mean, it was an old ship. It was a World War II freighter. We didn't have enough ships to get rid of to fight Japan. So these ships were created on a chewing gum. So there wasn't a well-made ship or anything like that. It was what was in there was the state-of-the-art of electronics, but the ship itself was weak.
Interesting.
It was not a strong ship that could withstand anything. Now, what you had on the ship, though, were sailors who had fought in World War II, who had been attacked by German short torpedoes and knew how to save the ship. And I'm thinking particularly of the chief engineer, whose name was George Golden, and he saved the ship. From a technical point of view, he knew what to do, and I describe it in the book. I'm not going to do it here because it's so technical.
Sure.
But how he did it, and otherwise they'd be gone. It was, it seems to have been an easy thing to sink this ship, except for the expertise of these marvelous career military people. After the attack, George Golden renounced his Judaism.
Interesting.
And he became a Baptist.
Oh, wow.
Became a Baptist preacher. And he didn't know what. And he worked for the St. Jude, the children's hospitals.
Uh-huh.
And he was trying to do some good. It's confusing how these people didn't have the education politically to understand what this was and who the United States had become.
Yeah.
Even as early as 1967, it seemed a mystery why they were even in Vietnam. There was a book, Why Are We in Vietnam? And they had no background, no structural background to understand what the United States had become, maybe since the Gilded Age, maybe earlier, according to Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States. All of this began on day one and just grew and grew and grew. But I don't know. It's a poignant story because George Golden, he knew we were scapegoats. We were scapegoats. And he wanted to talk. When the ship didn't sink. The next day, They finally got help. The Sixth Fleet sent ships, and they were the sick people and injured people dying. They were taken to the hospital on the USS American. After that, the ship limped along. It was sort of on an angle and listing. That's the word, listed. And they went to Malta for dry dock and also to clean out the bottom and get rid of that water that was there with the dead bodies floating in it.
Yeah.
And they were warned if they got off the ship and they went on the dock and they walked around Malta, they were never to talk to anyone. They were not to go in uniform. And George Golden talked to some Reuters reporters. I describe it in the book. And they sent him home the next day.
Joan, do you think this was an LBJ administration call? Do you think that that his administration alone had conspired?
Not alone. CIA and Angleton, James Angleton in particular, who was the head of the Israel desk at CIA, they'd been plotting this for several years. Mm-hmm. And Johnson, I think, really was preoccupied with Vietnam. This was an annoying, but Israel wanted Nasser gone more than the U.S., except for Angleton and Dulles. And so you can't put this all on LBJ, just as you can't put the JFK assassination only on Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson certainly was a vicious, demonic figure in all this. But he frightened a lot of people. When the sailors of the USS Liberty wrote their war crimes report, which they submitted to the Pentagon as was required, they don't even mention. It describes all the war crimes that Israel committed in this attack. They don't even mention Lyndon Johnson. I said, why don't you? I talked to the person who wrote it up, and I said, why didn't you mention Lyndon Johnson? He got mad at me and never spoke to me again. Why? What is so frightening now? Even now, though. You find, I hear Lyndon Johnson praised on Morning Joe. Well, it's a right-wing morning show, pretending to be liberal. I don't know what they are. But it's very hard to criticize Lyndon Johnson to this day.
Interesting.
And God knows if thank you very much, Ian, for putting me on your program. I appreciate it because it's not going to be easy. And one of the people I interviewed was the grandson of the son of Adlai Stevenson. If that was a person who ran against President Eisenhower twice.
Excellent.
And this fellow was a U.S. senator, also from Illinois, and he had after he left the Senate, he wanted to run for governor of Illinois. And the AIPAC, that means that's the Israel Lobby Association, went after him. They sent their forces in and resources. And he lost by one vote, by a very small amount, less than 1%.
So, Joan, do you think that Israel wanted the United States to basically attack Egypt for them? But
they did it. I see what you mean. Mm-hmm. Yes, because those planes that were sent to attack Cairo were U.S. planes with atom bombs in there, and the what do they call it? Nuclear. I can't think of the right word. Nuclear. In other words, they had nuclear aspects to them. Okay. They weren't big atom bombs, but they had nuclear capabilities. Rockets. I don't know what. I'm not an expert on that. But and they almost made it to their target. And only when the planes were called back, 7 minutes, and the admiral, the chief admiral of the Sixth Fleet, William Inman Martin, talked to some of the sailors of the Liberty who were recovering on his flagship, which was the USS Little Rock. And he sat on the bed, and wonderful people that talked to me, and he said, I just want you to know that we did what we can. We were sending planes to attack Cairo, and we're 7 minutes from target. And he told this to these sailors who never forgot it and talked. And so even Jim Ennis doesn't mention this, which he could have talked to Mo Schaefer, who was the sailor that talked about it later, and he didn't want to put it in. It's frightening to say that we sent. Well, yes, we almost had World War III. You can credit Lyndon Johnson with that.
Incredible, Joan. Incredible. You've given us some very insightful information, and I believe that listeners have whet their appetites to go out and purchase Blood in the Water. Joan, do you have any closing comments, any parting words for us?
I don't know what to say, except if you're interested in the truth behind the cover-ups, this is the place to start. It's one place to start. Others have done this too, but it's important to me as a writer to write the truth that has not been told, like a whistleblower.
Right.
I don't know if there's a feminine for female for whistleblower. It's harder to be a woman and do this work. People don't want to talk to women. But I did it, and I'm proud of it, and I hope people will read it and comment, send me an email, and look me up. I'm easy, and I'd love to talk to anyone that reads the book and wants to discuss it.
Excellent. Thank you, Joan. And on behalf of Windward Radio and Discussing the Truth, I can tell you that I'm extremely proud of the work that you've done here as well. Joan, have a wonderful rest of your evening, and good luck with your future endeavors. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Joan Mellen, Blood in the Water. I think she brings up a very good point here. Most Americans have no idea that their own country took out one of their own ships. She talked about the USS Maine, that arrived in Havana Harbor, and there was an explosive device that presumably blew up, that was planted by the American government. It's yellow journalism. I alluded to it with William Randolph Hearst. Okay? The blame was not put on the United States. That's where you get into these terms, false flag. We had 2 weeks ago Cody Snodgrass. He spent time behind bars because of information that he had regards to the Oklahoma City bombing. He says he's a former CIA black operative that was offered $1 million to blow up that Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City. Think about it, folks. Would your own government take out its own assets? There you've got two assets that Americans like you, average, everyday, hardworking people, are saying that, yes, your American government, in conjunction with its intelligence agency, the branch of the CIA, and quite possibly others, have conspired and have actually taken out their own assets. So who's behind that? Trump talks about deep state. What is the deep state? Average everyday things that we look into here on Discussion to Truth at Windward Radio that you probably haven't heard of and you take for granted. But if we are to save this republic with the foundation of a constitution, the most perfect document ever written by man, in my opinion, you must stand up for the truth and not accept anything else. Because like Dr. Mellen just said, this is a complete and total infringement on free press. Impeach mass media. I'll be right back with some closing comments.